Trump-backed hopefuls face tough foe in leadership races, secret ballots. Representative Jim Jordan is the latest Republican to get the former president's endorsement only to fall short. Donald Trump met his match, again, Wednesday on Capitol Hill, secret ballots. Despite a boisterous endorsement of Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, to be the next speaker, Trump's pick got just 99 votes in the behind-closed-doors vote in a sprawling committee room, less than 45% of the GOP caucus. Instead, Representative Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, leveraged his long tenure in multiple leadership positions over the past decade to secure the nomination, winning with a time-honored inside game that was built on personal relationships with lawmakers and not outside endorsements. Currently the House Majority Leader, Scalise still faces some doubt that he can unify Republican ranks enough to get the necessary 217 votes, out of 221 eligible GOP votes, when the full House holds its roll call later this week. Scalise vanquished Jordan despite the Judiciary Committee chair's higher-profile campaign, beginning with Trump's complete and total endorsement Saturday in a social media post. Jordan released more public endorsements than Scalise going into Wednesday's secret ballot. A constellation of outside conservative groups, including one whose top strategist is former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, who served 4 terms in the House, threw its support behind Jordan. But that outside pressure could not match Scalise's more than 10-year run of winning leadership races. In 2012, he won the chairmanship of the largest GOP caucus, then won a heavily contested majority whip race in 2014. And for the past 5 years, he has served in the number 2 post behind now-deposed Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California. One of the Old Testament things that came to fruition in this speaker's race was that if you've already been in leadership, you've probably been traveling the country and helping people get elected to the majority. Representative Thomas Massie, Republican, Kentucky, a Jordan supporter, lamented after the vote Wednesday. And so, Mr. Scalise has done a lot of that. A similar dynamic played out last November, after the GOP won a narrow House majority and the most heated internal contest formed around the number 3 post, majority whip. Trump technically remained on the sidelines, but his allies, most prominently his son Donald Trump Jr., lined up vociferously behind Representative Jim Banks, Republican, Indiana. Eventually Trump Jr. and Tucker Carlson, still a Fox News personality at the time, accused Banks's leading opponent, Representative Tom Emmer, Republican, Minnesota, of spreading bad information about Carlson's family. Banks, a regular guest on Fox's primetime shows, became the Trumpian candidate and won the most votes, 82, on the first ballot among 3 candidates. But Emmer, who had spent the previous 4 years as the campaign chief helping build the majority, played the inside game and won 115 to 106 on the second ballot. For veterans of intense GOP leadership fights of the 1990s and early 2000s, these outcomes this year make perfect sense. Having outsiders meddle in insider elections never goes well, said John Fury, a GOP consultant who served as a leadership aide for 10 years. And Trump is the ultimate outsider, and, frankly, most members don't like him very much. Trump has far and away more endorsements than any other 2024 Republican presidential contender, but by early September that total represented only about a third of the House GOP caucus. Many of the remaining Congress members would prefer a different nominee but are too afraid of the ex-president's wrath to get behind another political horse. To be sure, Jordan made the speaker race unusually competitive, Massie said. It's unconventional in that it was a competitive race, he said. It wasn't a coronation. It's been almost 30 years since such a tight battle happened for one of the 4 top caucus posts, House or Senate, Republican or Democrat. In 1994, Senator Tom Dashley of South Dakota became Democratic leader by a 2-vote margin, in a race that pivoted on the ultimate insider move, handing over a coveted committee assignment to the deciding vote. McCarthy faced token opposition on the secret ballot last November, defeating Representative Andy Biggs, Republican, Arizona, by a 188 to 31 margin. Representative Nancy Pelosi's toughest of 10 races to lead Democrats came after the 2016 elections, when the California Democrat defeated her internal opponent by a 2-to-1 margin. Jordan's biggest strength was his deeply ideological conservatism in a caucus that has grown much more conservative during his 17 years in the House. But he hasn't devoted nearly as much time to the interpersonal relationship building like McCarthy and Scalise. Scalise's base of support came from Southern delegations, whose ranks make up about 40% of the entire caucus. In 2014, he won the majority whip race in part by championing the need to have a Southern voice at the leadership table, at a time when an Ohioan, John A. Boehner, and a Californian, McCarthy, held the top two posts. Should he win the Speaker's gavel, Scalise will make a bit of history. The only other Southern Republican to become House Speaker, Newt Gingrich of Georgia, from 1995 through 1998, was born in Pennsylvania. Scalise also had overwhelming support from the 36 members of the House Appropriations Committee, a panel dominated by traditional Republicans who want government to function. They viewed Jordan, who has led past efforts to shut down the federal government, with deep disdain. In addition, Jordan has opposed earmarks, those narrow projects members request for their district, while Scalise has supported and secured such projects in recent years. And Scalise's allies poured out tons of data about how much political work he has done to benefit other Republican candidates since winning a special House election in 2008. Raising nearly $170 million to help Republicans win elections. Giving more than $7.2 million directly to Republican incumbents and candidates through his political committees. Transferring $50 million from his accounts to the National Republican Congressional Committee. And serving as special guest at 171 events for Republicans over 2021 and 2022 to 112 days on the road. He also touted his small-dollar fundraising operation, with 450,000 unique donors, an area in which Republicans have been thumped by Democrats over the past decade. None other than Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican, Florida, who led the rebellion that took McCarthy down last week, has pledged his support to publicly vote for Scalise in the public roll call whenever it's held. He said that his Florida Panhandle district shares much in common with Scalise's Gulf Coast district, so they have worked for years together on similar issues. Scalise supporters believe other McCarthy holdouts are ready to support him. The ones I've talked to are prepared to rally, said Representative Judy, Republican, Texas, chair of the House Budget Committee. But Massey said the public nature of the slow-rolling, alphabetical roll call on the House floor might give some members pause about voting for Scalise, with outside pressure potentially turning people away. I went into this thinking that Jordan has more public support, Massey said. Scalise has more private support. And, despite Jordan's call for unity and pledge to deliver Scalise's nominating speech, a group of hardline conservatives and some moderates still clamoring for McCarthy's return have vowed to block Scalise's elevation. Arrington acknowledged that Republicans might have to endure another humiliating experience with Scalise losing 1 or 2 ballots on the floor, but nothing like the 15 rounds McCarthy had to grind through to get the gavel in January. I don't know that it will go in round 1, but I do not expect it to go much further, he said. A tantalizing detail in a new Trump legal filing. The government signals it plans to prove Donald Trump's much-debated intent for taking and keeping classified documents. Donald Trump's many legal problems have led to a veritable fire hose of often mundane, procedural court filings. But occasionally, there's a nugget that catches your eye. Such was the case Monday, in the government's latest filing in Trump's classified documents case. While arguing against the motion by Trump's lawyers to delay the May 20 trial, special counsel Jack Smith's lawyers assured they're ready to go and that such a delay isn't necessary, unsurprisingly. But they also said they are ready to prove something significant that, to this point, has remained shrouded and the subject of much speculation, why Trump allegedly took and kept the documents. That the classified materials at issue in this case were taken from the White House and retained at Mar-a-Lago is not in dispute, Smith's office said. It then added that what is in dispute is how that occurred, why it occurred, what Trump knew, and what Trump intended in retaining them, all issues that the government will prove at trial primarily with unclassified evidence. The government apparently thinks it knows what Trump intended with the documents. And it's signaling that it plans to prove that intent. This would seem important, not only from a general interest standpoint but also from a legal one. Smith's team might not necessarily need to prove Trump's intention or his motive in the case. You have documents, you fail to return them when the government comes calling, and that's a crime regardless of why you did it, the argument goes. Trump's indictment in the case made no direct claims about a potential motive. But that doesn't mean proving Trump's motive wouldn't be helpful. Indeed, establishing a motive would seem to drive home the intention of Trump's actions and combat any arguments that this was all a misunderstanding, or that Trump somehow didn't know what he had, which the government has taken care to undermine. It's a lot like Smith's other indictment of Trump, the January 6 case. In that case, Smith need not necessarily prove that Trump knew that his claims of massive voter fraud were false to demonstrate that Trump broke the law in trying to overturn the election. But it too would be helpful, and Smith's office has made it abundantly clear that it intends to prove it, devoting 20 out of 45 pages from the indictment to that point. In each case, the government appears to be signaling that it's not going to leave stones unturned and that it intends to get into that much-debated space between Trump's ears. What that alleged motive could be remains anyone's guess. But there are some prevailing theories about why Trump might have done it. One of them, promoted by Trump's allies, is that he's a pack rat and that these documents just happen to be mixed in with a bunch of other, less problematic materials that were taken from the White House. But not only is there all kinds of evidence that he took an interest in the boxes and their contents as the government was trying to retrieve them, but the government has said Trump was also involved in packing the materials when he left the White House in January 2021. Another, somewhat less nefarious explanation would be that he viewed even sensitive materials as something akin to trophies and mementos, his beautiful mind materials, in the words of one aide. Where things could get even hairier for Trump is if the government can demonstrate that he intended to use the documents for some purpose. And at least in one case, the government has gestured toward to a potential purpose. Perhaps the most significant document in the indictment deals with a plan for attacking Iran, which Trump allegedly showed to a writer and a publisher. A recording of the scene has been made public. The document and recording are significant because they show Trump acknowledging, in real time, that the document is classified and that he never declassified it, contrary to his public suggestions about the documents. Trump had also initially said the document didn't exist and that his talk was mere bravado, before Smith's team added the actual alleged document to a superseding indictment. But they're also significant because they showed Trump actually apparently using the documents for a purpose, in the service of going after a target of his ire, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark A. Milley. "I just found, isn't that amazing?" Trump said in the recording. "This totally wins my case, you know." The New Yorker had reported in July 2021 that Milley had feared Trump would start a war with Iran to stay in power. Here was Trump, less than a week later, using an allegedly classified document to argue that it was actually Milley who was trigger-happy. A similar scene was later recounted in Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' book, though the book merely cites Trump having recalled such a document rather than actually showing it off. Meadows' book wrote unflatteringly about Milley's plan to attack Iran, deploying massive numbers of troops, something he urged President Trump to do more than once during his presidency. President Trump denied those requests every time. To the extent Trump used a classified document to go after a critic, that could suggest he saw value in the documents beyond just keeping them or showing them off to burnish his ego. Milley has said he never recommended attacking Iran, and such documents are often drawn up as contingencies. Whether other evidence points in this direction, we don't yet know. But Smith's team has clearly shown an interest in whether Trump used the documents for his personal advantage. In April it subpoenaed information about the dealings of Trump's businesses with foreign countries, for instance, apparently in search of a possible financial motive. But such a motive wasn't referenced in Trump's indictment, and as of November 2022 it hadn't been established, The Washington Post reported. Whatever that alleged motive might ultimately be, we'll apparently learn about it at some point. What a Speaker Scalise might mean for the GOP. Republicans have chosen to move forward with Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, as their nominee for the next House Speaker. That hardly guarantees him the job, given the Republican Party's razor-thin majority and continued internal dissension. But it does make Scalise the most likely successor to Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, at least for now. So what might it mean if he's ultimately elected in a vote of the entire House? Scalise is generally viewed as a more conservative version of McCarthy. That's something that might have played to his benefit in a vote of the GOP conference, but it makes his prospects for securing the 217 votes necessary to be elected uncertain. While some McCarthy critics have indicated they will or might support him, including Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican, Florida, others will be distrustful of Scalise by virtue of his alignment with McCarthy and the GOP establishment. And the fact that Republicans didn't move to a floor vote immediately after Wednesday's conference vote betrays the uncertainty ahead. Beyond that, it's worth a review of where Scalise stands on key issues, not only because of how they might bear on the speaker votes, but what they suggest about what his speakership would look like. Perhaps the policy issue of most immediate concern is the looming government shutdown, with the deal McCarthy cut giving Congress only until mid-November. Scalise has historically been less in favor of such brinkmanship than the man the House GOP chose him over, Representative Jim Jordan, Ohio, who spearheaded the GOP's shutdown fights as a leader of the hard-right House Freedom Caucus. And he did vote for McCarthy's deals with Democrats to end the recent shutdown and debt-ceiling fights. Of course, anything less would have been highly unusual from the number 2 House Republican. But despite the tight time frame for the looming shutdown, the Washington Post reported that Scalise has been reluctant to embrace another temporary extension. And in announcing his run for Speaker, he indicated he might be in favor of a harder line in bargaining for policy concessions. Now we need to take our unified positions and work to extract conservative wins from the Democrat, IC, Senate and White House by leveraging upcoming deadlines, he said last week. If we stay united, we can preserve leverage for the House to secure tangible wins in our impending policy fights. Another big question looming over the next speaker is Ukraine funding. Large majorities of Congress have supported continuing aid to Ukraine, but a growing segment of the House GOP opposes it. And the major question is whether a speaker will even bring funding up for votes. Scalise hasn't, of late, made the kinds of strongly pro-Ukraine funding comments that McCarthy did and has emphasized that the funding should be scrutinized. But he also called the war a genocide early on after Russia's invasion. And unlike Jordan, he has repeatedly voted in favor of funding, including $40 billion last year, and against efforts to strip it, including the $300 million that nearly half of Republicans voted to eliminate 2 weeks ago. He earned a B on the recent pro-Ukraine Republicans for Ukraine scorecard. That placed him more in favor of Ukraine funding than the median House Republican, but it dinged him for comments calling for more scrutiny of the funds. As with McCarthy, the issue would seem to be less how Scalise feels personally and more how much political capital he's willing to spend to secure the funding. Allowing a vote on another major aid package could be a red line for at least some members, including Marjorie Taylor Greene. Scalise could need to secure the 217 votes for the speakership. McCarthy recently stripped that $300 million from a defense spending bill to secure its passage, a reflection of the difficult choices ahead. While those are perhaps the 2 imminent areas in which a speaker could matter on the policy front, there are plenty of other ways in which Scalise could guide the party. Some of the big ones have to do with Donald Trump and President Biden, whether that's the new impeachment inquiry of Biden, the supposed weaponization of the government or election denialism. Scalise is seemingly less aligned with the hard right on these issues than Jordan, who leads the House GOP's weaponization subcommittee and has spun elaborate conspiracy theories. But Scalise has echoed much of the same rhetoric. In August, he alleged that federal law enforcement is being abused to go after political opponents. He also baselessly suggested that Trump's indictments are politically timed. Last year, he claimed that the FBI agents searching Mar-a-Lago went rogue, prompting pushback from a Fox News host. After the January 6, 2021 attack, Scalise called the events at the Capitol domestic terrorism. But he voted to reject Biden electors that day and later voted against impeaching Trump. Scalise last month called the evidence against Biden incredibly devastating already, despite the GOP's own witnesses at the first impeachment inquiry hearing acknowledging there was little direct evidence tying Biden to anything nefarious. On just about all counts, Scalise is perhaps more within the GOP mainstream than Jordan and somewhat further to the right than McCarthy. But that GOP mainstream has also clearly shifted to the right in recent years. Now we will see whether Scalise is viewed as sufficiently able to carry the Republican mantle forward, whenever the speaker vote on the House floor might actually come. House adjourns without voting on Scalise as Speaker. The Republican-led House adjourned Wednesday without voting on House Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, as Speaker. The chamber will convene on Thursday, though no votes are scheduled. Scalise narrowly won his party's nomination earlier Wednesday in a race that also included Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio. The delay in a vote by the full House signals that Scalise is still working to win support of Jordan backers. Becoming Speaker requires a majority vote in the full, narrowly divided House. Here's what to know. Scalise is seeking to succeed Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, whose ouster as Speaker last week was led by hardline conservatives. Ahead of the voting, House Republicans shot down a proposed rule change that would have increased the threshold needed to nominate a Speaker to well beyond a simple majority of the conference. Who are House Speaker candidates Jordan and Scalise? Democratic divisions over Israel resurface after ceasefire comments. Democrats harshly rebuked several left-leaning lawmakers who have called for a ceasefire as Israel-Gaza war escalates. The deadly attacks on Israel by Hamas militants have reignited divisions in the Democratic Party over the Middle East, with many elected officials and leaders vowing unequivocal support for Israel's right to defend itself, while some left-leaning lawmakers condemned the violence but urged both sides to agree to a ceasefire. These schisms were on display Sunday night during a candidate forum in California, when 3 House Democrats running for the U.S. Senate answered questions about Israel. Representative Adam B. Schiff, who is Jewish, called the Hamas attacks Israel's own 9/11 and pledged unequivocal support for the security and the rights of Israel. Representatives Katie Porter and Barbara Lee similarly denounced the violence, but Porter also warned of a rise to hateful Muslimphobia and civil rights violations similar to what emerged after the 9/11 attacks in the United States. Lee said it was the United States' responsibility to call for a ceasefire. Then, at a pro-Israel rally in Boston on Monday, the crowd booed Senator Edward J. Markey, Democrat, Massachusetts, when he called for a de-escalation of violence, according to video of the event. Shortly after, Representative Jake Auchincloss, Democrat, Massachusetts, who is Jewish, seemed to disavow his Senate colleague's remarks. Israel did not ask America to de-escalate on September 12, 2001, he said to cheers from the crowd. In New York City, tensions flared again when several Democratic leaders, including Senator Charles E. Schumer and Governor Kathy Hochul, denounced a pro-Palestinian rally sponsored by the Democratic Socialists of America. Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jamal Bowman, New York, both DSA-endorsed lawmakers, condemned the Hamas attack but echoed calls to end the ongoing violence. On Wednesday, Representative Sri Feinder, Michigan, announced he was renouncing his DSA membership, saying in a statement, Sunday's hate-filled and anti-Semitic rally in New York City, promoted by the NYCDSA, makes it impossible for me to continue my affiliation. The nuanced positions and mixed responses from Democrats since the attacks early Saturday resurfaced the party's divergent views on the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the most sharply divisive issues separating a handful of left-wing Democrats from more strident Israel defenders, and often leading to inter-party disagreements. In the wake of the unprecedented and intensifying conflict, several liberal Democrats have urged a de-escalation of violence, while most Democrats, including the Biden administration, have pledged to support Israel unconditionally. The distinction in rhetoric also illustrates a shift within the party in recent years as more Democrats have grown critical of the Israeli government's far-right policies and treatment of Palestinians, a departure from U.S. politicians' long-standing and near-unanimous position to support Israel. The Republican Party has emerged as the Israel right or wrong party. Israel can do no wrong. You'll find no Republican willing to criticize the Netanyahu government, said Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former Middle East advisor in the State Department, referring to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Democratic Party is more complicated, he continued. They're divided among traditional Democrats who are strong supporters of Israel, and the growing willingness in the Democratic Party to express not just disapproval, but want some accountability for Israel policies that undermine American policies. It is a relatively new development to see this separation between Republicans who have a wall of support and increasingly more nuances and divisions among Democrats. More than 1,000 Israelis, including children, were killed in Hamas's surprise attacks over the weekend, according to the Israeli embassy in Washington, and a growing counterattack by Israeli forces in Gaza has also caused heavy civilian casualties, the Palestinian Health Ministry said. Liberal Democrats have decried Netanyahu's declaration of war and order of a complete siege, including cutting off food, fuel and electricity to the occupied territory it has long blockaded, saying it will result in the loss of more innocent lives. Representative Rashida Tlaib, Democrat, Michigan, the only Palestinian American in Congress, and Representative Cori Bush, Democrat, Missouri, released statements in the hours after the attack criticizing Israel over its past treatment of Palestinians and urging peace in the region. In her initial response, Tlaib labeled Israel's apartheid system as leading to resistance. As part of achieving a just and lasting peace, Bush said, "We must do our part to stop this violence and trauma by ending U.S. government support for Israeli military occupation and apartheid." Representative Ilhan Omar, Democrat, Minnesota, a Somali-American Muslim, referenced in her first statement the back-and-forth cycle of violence, and in subsequent days she has posted several times about the violence against Palestinians. But many Democrats and supporters of Israel have slammed the notion of a mutual ceasefire, characterizing it as offensive to suggest Israel should not defend itself and prevent attacks after suffering its most devastating and brutal assault in decades. At a pro-Israel rally in Philadelphia on Monday, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Democrat, one of the most prominent elected Jewish officials, seemed to rebuff those who have called for an end to violence on both sides. "We must call out what is right and what is so obviously wrong. The whataboutism used by some to justify Hamas's unprovoked actions is ignorant and wrong," Shapiro said. "There is no moral equivalency here. Israel has a right to defend itself." But the Biden administration also struggled with the tenor of its initial response. Shortly after the attacks, Secretary of State Antony Blinken posted on X, advocating a ceasefire. He soon deleted it and replaced it with the post, "Israel has the right to defend itself, rescue any hostages, and protect its citizens." Asked about the deleted post, a State Department spokesperson said, "The tweet didn't accurately reflect the language of the accompanying readout, which noted we are calling for Hamas to stop its terrorist attacks on Israel. That is our position, as the Secretary has made clear repeatedly." President Biden, during remarks Tuesday at the White House, which was aglow Monday night in blue and white, the colors of the Israeli flag, vowed to stand by the Jewish state. "We must be crystal clear, we stand with Israel. We will make sure Israel has what it needs," he said. At Tuesday's daily briefing, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre sharply rebuked the members of Congress who have called for a ceasefire, criticizing them as repugnant and disgraceful. "Our condemnation lies squarely with terrorists who brutally raped, kidnapped hundreds of Israelis. There can be no equivocation about that. There are not two sides on this," she said. The fray among Democrats is also becoming an attack line for Republicans, including former President Donald Trump, who seized on the divisions Monday night at a campaign rally in New Hampshire. "I can't imagine how anybody who's Jewish or anybody who loves Israel. I can't imagine anybody voting Democrat, let alone for this man," he said, referring to Biden. Israeli leaders have praised Biden for his support in the days since the attacks. Two of the largest pro-Israel advocacy organizations, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and J Street, said in separate statements that a majority of Republicans and Democrats in Congress have vowed to stand resolutely with Israel. In the days since the barbaric terrorist attack on Israel, there has been an extraordinary bipartisan expression of support for the Jewish state. In just 2 days, 95% of members of Congress from both parties issued statements of solidarity with Israel, Marshall Whitman, a spokesman for AIPAC, said in an emailed statement. But partisan cracks could soon reopen when House lawmakers take up a bipartisan resolution condemning Hamas and reaffirming Israel's right to self-defense. In July, when the House passed a bipartisan resolution saying that Israel is not a racist or apartheid state and that the United States will always be a staunch partner and supporter of Israel, 9 Democrats voted against it. Those Democrats included Tlaib, Omar, Ocasio-Cortez, and Ayanna Pressley, Massachusetts, members of the squad of younger women of color who represent more liberal views on most issues, including criticism of Israel. Matt Duss, a former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, Independent, Vermont, defended the Liberal Democrats, saying it's possible to not only condemn Hamas, but also worry about the humanity of Palestinians. Often the case in the U.S. policy debate is we recognize rights for only one side, Duss said. There is an increasing number of Democrats who are willing to acknowledge that there is a deeper context here. Palestinians also have a right to security and dignity and have been under occupation and blockade for years. It doesn't justify the Hamas attack, but there's a willingness among progressives that Palestinian lives matter like Israeli lives matter. But Representative Richie Torres, Democrat, New York, who is staunchly pro-Israel, said the Democratic Party is united in its support for Israel, with a few exceptions that he said are not representative of the majority. Every country, every sovereign state has the right to defend itself, and if you and your neighbors were the targets, had your homes invaded, if you and your neighbors were murdered or wounded or terrorized, what would you expect your government to do? Torres said. Those who insist Israel should do nothing in the face of unprecedented terrorism are holding the Jewish state to a double standard that no other country, including the United States, would ever impose on itself, he said. John Hudson contributed to this report.